Fellow tennis nerds, I'm here with a distinguished guest today, Christopher Clarey. You might have read his work. He's been writing 20 years for New York Times as a sports journalist, focusing mainly on tennis, I would say. And he has written a great book, which I can really recommend, called The Master. It's about Roger Federer, who you might have heard of. And now he's working on a new book that I'm very excited about Rafa Nadal. How are you, Chris?
Hey, Jonas, good to see you. No, I'm good. I'm here in north of Boston, up in the woods, and getting ready to watch some Wimbledon and write a book. So it's going to be busy.
So this is your writer's lodge, kind of.
This is my house here where I'm at, and we've been here about 20 years as a base. Lots of travel, obviously. And it's a place that's been good. Been good to my writing and good to us. So I'm happy to be back here, and my life just changed. I just left the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, formally. So after 30 plus years of working for them, and definitely a big move for me, but excited about this next book and this next chapter of life.
What prompted you to make that decision after such a long time? Was it just a change at the paper or something?
No, actually it was my call, 100%. I felt like at this stage of my life, I'm in my late 50s now. I've been a daily journalist, like I said, for 32, actually more, almost 40 years. I worked in San Diego before the New York Times. And I felt like it was really a positive experience writing The Master about Federer. It was, painful, as we'll discuss. As you a novelist yourself, as you mentioned, you know what it's like. But ultimately, it was a really positive experience. I feel very lucky that it was so positive, and really enjoyed, the planning, most of the process of writing it. And I really enjoyed also, I think, which is key, I think I really enjoyed the promotion of it afterward, talking to people all over the world, people like yourself, about the book, about tennis, about Federer, the lessons we can learn. And now I'm going to do one called The Warrior with the same publishers about Nadal. I can't talk too much about the details of it because it's obviously still in process, but I just felt like it was a great opportunity. The publishers gave me an excellent deal, and I basically had to choose at this point in my life whether I wanted to keep writing daily reports for the New York Times or take the break and do the book. I couldn't do both. And if I were 10 years younger, I probably wouldn't have made this choice, but at this stage, it felt like the right thing to do, and I'm excited. But talk to me in about 6 months' time, and I'll tell you if I was right.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think focus is so important, I think, in life. I mean, today everybody's, and myself very much so, you're distracted all the time. Like, there's phones, there's stuff, life is always going on. So I think, like, doing that kind of romantic thing of focusing on your craft, even though it's probably going to be somewhat painful at times, obviously, because you sit down, you have to do it, and you might not feel in the mood, right? Not inspired that day. So it's a tough one, but it's also some kind of, nothing good comes out of ease, right? So it's probably good that you do some suffering there, right?
Yeah, I think probably, I've never been a fiction writer except maybe at university, taking some classes. I think nonfiction is probably a little more straightforward than fiction. In fiction, you got to be in that creative mindset and be able to really enter other worlds in a way that you create yourself. And nonfiction, hopefully, you're not doing that. That's the idea, not to be writing any fiction. And I think you have the challenge with nonfiction is, from my limited experience, is just there's so much material, and how do you organize it? How do you structure it? And I think that's going to be the challenge, both fun and nasty, about this one.
Yeah, for the Master, you had lots of personal conversations with Roger to kind of base that on. You have obviously a lot of personal insight, connection. What prompted you to make that decision? Because it was obviously a big step. You were writing daily for the New York Times, lots of work, and then you want to create this book. And it's like the timing was kind of perfect, with the retirement happening, I guess soon thereafter, when after you published it. So how did that process go from idea in your head until you finished product?
Like a lot of sports writers, like a lot of journalists, we all have dreams of writing books. I know I have since I was a young boy, actually, really. I grew up reading books after books in the library, and Sports Illustrated magazine, which was a big thing in our culture in the U.S. for a long time as a kid. It was really, really high quality when I was growing up. So I think we all had, literary ambitions of some sort. A lot of us do. And just for me, I was so taken up with my family and my daily work with the New York Times, which was so fantastic in many ways. I was so lucky to have it and got a chance to cover many, many sports all over the world for 3 decades. And tennis has been my main thing that I know the best, but I've done just about every sport you can think of over the years too. So I just felt like along the way, I'd met a lot of people, met a lot of famous athletes, interviewed a lot of people. But the connection with Federer, for a lot of reasons, some of them coincidental, some of them not, was really particularly deep and really, really rich in terms of the connections that I've had with him over the years and the opportunities that I got to really sit down with him in depth from a pretty young age all the way through his career. And there was really nobody else like that I came across as a famous athlete or a prominent athlete. And I just think ultimately, I don't know how you are, but for me, there's always that equation of, do you want to feel disappointment or do you want to feel regret? And I guess I don't want to live with regret. And if I hadn't done the book, having had all that material and all that opportunity, I think I would have really regretted it. So I'd rather live with the disappointment of maybe I don't do it as well as I hope to or whatever. And honestly, a lot of it has to do with the subject matter. People really connect with Federer all over the world for a lot of different reasons, but the book was a big success. So really there was no disappointment for me to deal with after the fact. I think just you can always do better. You can always find another person to talk to, another angle to look at. But with the time that I had, I felt like I did the best I could do. And ultimately, the hardest thing about the book was really, I think, marshaling all the information. I'd talked to Roger over 20 years, more than 20 times, a lot of times, in depth. He's not my friend. He's my subject. I'm not his friend. I'm a journalist interviewing him, but we had a good professional connection. And I think the hardest thing was just figuring out how to present that the best way. And ultimately, I didn't want to do a biography where it was like, Roger was born in Basel. His parents, took him out of the cradle and placed him in I didn't want to have it be like that. I wanted it to be based around a little more creative structure. And the way I think the way it worked for me was taking it and making it very location-based. The places where we did the interviews, but also the places that mattered the most in his life and in his career. And so the book was built around these different places all the way through, probably 22 places in total, everything from Basel to Écublens in Switzerland, where he was training as a teenager when he first left home, to South Africa, where his mother is from, and where he played his exhibition with Nadal, where I went and saw that. So all these different places have mattered. And then, of course, Wimbledon, Melbourne, Australia, Paris, France, and also New York. So those were all the key spots. But the challenge in that, Jonas, I won't go on much longer here, but the challenge on that was to find a way, if it's not chronological, if you're going to use a chapter on Wimbledon, say, and you put it early in your book, because it needs to be, because Roger ended up winning pretty early on, and he won junior Wimbledon there as well. How do you integrate the 20 times he played after that within that chapter? So that was the real challenge of that structure. I loved the structure initially, but I kind of came to be thinking it was a bit more than I should have challenged myself with, because it was very hard to get the timeline right at times. But I think ultimately we got it, and I'm glad I did it that way, because I think he's such a global guy. I mean, the way he sees the world, the way he's lived his life, the way he wants to live his life, very international. So that was the way that had to be.
Yeah, I liked the structure. I thought it was very creative, and I also thought it gave kind of like a good overview of his life, and his structure, like you said, it was thought through, because it's easy to write maybe an ABC biography where it's like facts, 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 but this felt more personal. It felt more like based on actual stories that were key in his development as a player and a person as well, because I think you really had a good balance there of talking about Roger as a person and as a player, and the whole team around him as well, Mirka, and the financial side of Roger and everything, and which made the book, I read other biographies about Roger, but none as good as this one, not even close, because it just had all the extra information, but also structured in a way that was entertaining to read.
Thanks, Jonas. I appreciate that. I mean, a lot went into it. It's obviously 20 plus years of spending time with him and really writing about him a lot, and then finding a way to take a different perspective once you've made the decision to write long form. How do you kind of not forget all that, put that aside a little bit, and then re-report and rethink it? And that was actually the fun of it, to be honest, looking back on it, was being able to, go back and say, what did I miss? What sort of big themes might I have missed along the way? Definitely it's that forest and the trees metaphor, and it's true. I mean, you're so close to it, you don't always see it. And what really helped me was to go back and talk to everybody I hadn't talked to, who would talk to me. I never did get a chance to speak with Mirka again, his wife, for the book. That was not something Roger wanted to do. But everybody else over the years that had been important, I think, to his story, not Peter Carter, obviously his coach from Australia, who passed away sadly very young, but a lot of people I hadn't spoken with as a daily print journalist, and hearing what they thought about Roger's path now, after it was nearing the end. And those conversations were really rich. And also, it was important to me to try to get inside the people who were important to him. So maybe mini biographies of the people that were part of his path, particularly guys like Pierre Paganini, and guys like Ivan Lubicic, who coached him as well. Peter Carter, even though I didn't know him personally, trying to get to his story through people who did know him. And then some of his rivals who I had, in the early years especially, who we've forgotten because we've become so Big Three focused now in our view of men's tennis. Obviously, you had to write about Novak in a profound way in the book and about Nadal. But also, Roger started off with rivals like Leighton Hewitt, Murat Safin, Andy Roddick. I wanted to go back and look at those people and really get their sense of things. And I was lucky that they were willing to talk to me. So that made a big difference, I think, for the book.
Yeah, I think you sometimes forget. I mean, sports and life move so fast, so you sometimes forget about these stars of yesteryear that weren't quite of the level of the GOATs, because they took all the Grand Slams for such a long time, pretty much. You have a few exceptions with Del Potro, for example, and Safin early before Federer came along. But now it's all about the GOATs and the GOATs. And if you would write like a book about Novak Djokovic, what would the title be? Do you have one in your head?
I will tell you on our podcast if I ever do that. That'd be good.
Yeah.
But no, for sure. Good. I mean, it's you can't not think about it. But let me get through number 2 here, and we'll see how this one goes.
Yeah, because it's like you're thinking, the warrior perfect, and the master perfect, and and then you start popping in some different adjectives for Novak as well. He's.
Hey, feel free, Jonas. I'd love to hear your suggestion, but I mean, you tell me.
Yeah. Now for me, he's a chess player. Like, I mean, I was always a big Roger fan. And I was also fortunate to meet him at least once, and talk to him, and Rafa a few times. And Novak, lives in Marbella, so it's a bit easier access at least. Can go down and watch him practice here in Spain. But I'm fascinated by these guys, and I always, as a person around tennis, you always start to think about what makes them so special, because tennis is one of the most difficult sports in the world, I would say. You need the physicality, the technique, everything needs to come together. What is kind of the special ingredient in Roger and Rafa and Novak, would you say?
Well, I think the answer is different in each, and I'm not going to get into Rafa too much, only because I feel like I'm going to get into that a lot in the book, and I'd rather talk about it with you when we're done with it as opposed to starting it. But one thing that's really interesting is just to see how, obviously, the results, you see these guys are extremely competitive at the highest level. I think what separates these guys especially is the longevity of that competition and the longevity of that excellence. I mean, just look at a guy like Bjorn Borg, close to Swedish hearts and close to many hearts. I mean, the guy only lost twice at Roland Garros. Rafa lost 3 times. So, but Bjorn played
exactly.
Not as long, and Bjorn couldn't ultimately take the strain of what it took to be that good and be that dominant and to sustain it. So I think, really, the most remarkable thing about these 3 guys to me is the sustained excellence. And they came to it from somewhat different backgrounds, for sure. I mean, obviously, Novak, radically different than Rafa and Roger, for sure. Rafa and Roger have a little bit more commonality, I would say. The difference with Rafa is that it's basically a Tony and Rafa show. I mean, it's his uncle and Rafa, obviously the whole family. Whereas Roger had a lot of different influences. And so did Novak. Novak had Jelena Gencic, who was his inspiration and his mentor, kind of Tony Nadal style, outside of his family, young. But then they all soon moved on, whereas Rafa never did move on really formally until much, much later in life. So I guess that's where they separate in their origin stories. And Novak obviously had to fight through so much more just to get to a place where he could even play tennis at a high level because of all the obstacles with Serbia and ex-Yugoslavia and everything else. But that internal drive has to be there. And I think the early years are so critical. I mean, you can't get it wrong as a boy in tennis or a girl in tennis and then end up being a great player. You have to get it more or less right. There are different ways to get it right as a youth, but you can't overcome that. It's just too important on the technique side, the mentality side, and everything else.
Yeah, talking about the youth, I mean, we have a guy now who's looks like, I mean, in my opinion, he's like in a lab product from Rafa and Roger's DNA, right? Carlos Alcaraz, and he's won slam already, semifinals against Novak. He had cramps, which was a bit bit weird or sad, how do you put it? But where do you think his place in history will be, and do you watch him with the same kind of reverence as you did with Roger and Rafa, for example?
I don't want to burden Carlos with too much. I gotten to know him a little bit, actually. I've interviewed him a few times already with the New York Times opening that door, and I spent some time with him early on. I would say, I watch him with incredible pleasure. It really is similar to watching Roger early on. I mean, I remember watching Federer in that match against Sampras 2001, watching him destroy us in Davis Cup in 2001, which I talk about in the book, beat the U.S. pretty much single-handedly in Basel. I mean, it's just a pleasure to watch tennis shots being produced in that manner. And the difference with Roger would be that, Roger did it, ultimately he had to do it in a very self-contained way to succeed. He had to put on a mask, Bjorn Borg-like, and find a way to contain everything to make his tennis shine. Whereas Carlos is not like that. Carlos is somebody who I think needs to express a bit to be able to play his best, as he's talked about in some interviews and talked about with me too. Just he's at his best when he's expressive a bit and sharing things with the public. And that is a very special formula, I think, for public who's going to watch him play, hopefully over many years, because you can really connect with him. I mean, the Federer beauty of the game, the dignity of the process, the elegance of it all was very appealing. But there's a connective tissue emotionally with Carlos and the public, which is very special. And so I think that'll be, if he can stay healthy. And I agree the cramps were disturbing and unexpected to me. I know he's had some issues with that in the past against Sinner in Miami, for example. He later said that he'd had some problems against Tsitsipas at the U.S. Open back in 2021. I didn't notice that, but obviously he did. But to see it be that debilitating and that big a match, considering how well they were both playing and how that match was setting up, really, really unsettling. So we'll see how it goes forward. But a lot of young guys have had issues, and remember James Blake from our country in the U.S. having trouble with that early and conquers it. But as far as the game, it's just electric. I never get tired of watching him play. I went down to not Mallorca, listen to me. I went down to Alicante and to the Ferrero Academy, spent a couple days there in December 2021. And I went down to kind of watch practice and just observe him in his environment there. And I'm not sure if you've been there or not, but definitely wasn't going down super excited about watching practice for a couple of days. But I loved it. I mean, I sat down next to the court with Ferrero and Alcaraz for a couple of days, and I just didn't want to leave. I mean, it was just everything he does with a racket in hand is often spectacular. It's just the way he moves, the aerial quality to his tennis, the way he produces the shots, the intensity that goes into each shot, but also the joy that goes into each shot. So I don't want to burden him with 20 slams or 15 slams or 14 French Opens, but he is, for me, clearly the most exciting talent in tennis and one of the most exciting talents in sports right now. So we'll see where it goes. I hope he can fulfill his potential, whatever that is.
Yeah, I think he's one guy that seems tough to burden. Sometimes you feel like you're putting a lot of hopes and expectations on players, and they're like, oh, I'm feeling it. You feel that they're feeling it. You've seen that over in history, but Carlos seems to just lap it up. Like he seems naturally born for the big time sports and the screen, and it's like he's destined for it. But the asterisk always seems to be the body. So, just fingers crossed, and usually they figure these things out. But I wanted to get to that because tennis has changed so much. You've covered tennis for so long now. And what have you seen as changes from like 90s to now in how the game has evolved and everything around it?
Well, I think just the ultimate professionalization of it started with, you could say, Ivan Lendl, really, or Navratilova. It was before my time, just before I started covering tennis in the late 80s. They had sort of reached their peaks in the 80s, and they both took the professionalization of tennis and the structure of their training and everything and their hygiene of life and all that to a new level. But these guys today, with the means at their disposal, these players today have taken it even farther. And they've done it with very specialized teams. They've done it with, I think, the art of recovery and recuperation. You've seen a lot more use of, stim and different things like that to be able to recover. It used to be kind of, pop some ice on or hop in the ice bath. It's a lot more than that now. And just each player at the higher level now, because of the prize money getting better for the guys in the top 100, whereas maybe 4 or 5 guys back in the early 2000s could afford to have a really solid team. Now a lot of guys can. So I think that's a good trend in a way. I mean, it makes it tougher for the guys really far down the chain to be able to get into that group. But once you're there with the Grand Slam prize money and hopefully some sponsorship and things like that, you can put together a decent sort of attempt at a team pretty early on. And I think that's so important to be able to compete with the guys at the highest level. Other thing I see is just the danger coming from all over the court now, really. Back, I think about Pete Sampras a lot, and Sampras was the most successful player. Rod Laver was in terms of overall results, but in the open era total, I'd say Sampras probably was for quite a while. And he had a great forehand and a great serve, and he could volley well, but the backhand was kind of a safe space. Andre Agassi took the ball super early off both wings, could hurt you with the backhand and the forehand from either side, but couldn't volley really well. Mobility was a bit reduced. Serve wasn't great. Obviously a big returner as well. So I just think a lot of the great players in the past had not a hole, but a safe space. But you look at the way the game has gone now, at a Novak or a Rafa or a Roger or a Carlos Alcaraz, there's no safe space. Those guys can kill you from anywhere. They have all the shots. Maybe they don't use all of them enough to be able to use them at their ultimate under pressure. But you can see now with Alcaraz and the way he's bringing the game with the drop shots and the attacking the net, it's the full canvas and really can produce power from or danger from just about anywhere. And I think that is different from the way tennis used to be played. And personally, I think that's a real evolution and a great thing. The racket changes with the strings in particular, having changed the game and allowing these massive swing speeds and a little more safety. Would I personally like to see a little bit more challenge in there and a little bit of a rollback? I think I would personally. I wouldn't mind seeing that. I think it does take a bit of the craft away at times. But ultimately, the spectacle is pretty extraordinary. And to watch an Alcaraz Sinner match, which is the next generation tennis match, or I would imagine even the other day, I watched a lot of Alcaraz and de Minaur. That's also it's a great product. Great to watch. All kinds of excitement. Not a lot of dead space. So I kind of like where the game's gotten to. But I guess the question is, where do you go from here? I guess you get guys who are 6'8", who can run like deer, like a Zverev type of body, or 6'6", who can do everything really well, like an Alcaraz. I guess that could take it to a new level. Carlos is 6'1", but I'm not quite sure where the progress will come. But history tells me it'll come.
Yeah, at some point I think we might get to a point where you need to adjust the rules a little bit, whether it's maybe reducing it to one serve, changing the equipment back to maybe smaller head sizes, or just limiting the strings. I mean, we've seen that in golf, for example, like the remove the chin putter. They do these incremental adjustments to make the sport more fair, I guess, and maybe more appetizing also on television and so on. What we've seen, when you look at some stats, I'm not sure exactly how verifiable this is, but it makes some sense, is that the TV audience of tennis, they're getting older. Do you think that should be a worry for us tennis fans and people in tennis? What do you think about that? Is the future very bright or a little bit so-so?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see a couple of years from now what those figures show. I know that's also a continental thing. Obviously, in my country, in the U.S., that's proven to be true. I imagine in a lot of Western Europe, that's proven to be true. I know in Asia, it's not. I know in Asia, the tennis public is not an older public. It's much younger demographically. Maybe it's not as big yet, but the potential is obviously huge there. And as you see people like some of these Chinese men coming up, like Wu and Jerry and Zhang and those sorts of personalities arriving, the game could get a new wave in different parts of the world. That's always been tennis's strength and weakness, but also its strength is that it's been able to, sort of move around and create pockets of passion wherever the biggest stars are coming from. Probably a lot of tennis being discussed in Tunisia these days, in the Arab world, in a way it wasn't before Ons Jabeur. I imagine that probably also skews quite a bit younger as well. But I saw an interesting figure a couple of days ago in the U.S. where there was a poll of people looking at which sports did they want to see streamed on their current providers? People, things like Amazon Prime or Netflix or HBO Max, things like that. So it was a poll of different age groups. And actually, tennis was like 6th or 7th sport in the U.S. in terms of demand, and it was probably at about 7 or 8% of the respondents wanted to see more of it on their streaming services. But the interesting thing to me was the overall population and Gen Z, which is the youngest group, were about the same. So I sense maybe in Gen Z, maybe because of already some of the Netflix stuff with Breakpoint and some of the big focus on Serena Williams and over in the U.S. in particular. This is only a U.S. poll. But I was surprised there wasn't more of a gap there between the overall population and the younger population. It was very similar. So some shifts in the plates may be happening to some degree. But I do think, tennis is, at least in my culture, just because of the huge tennis boom that there was, and basically it was kind of the only racket sport that counted for a while. I think that'll be hard to replicate to get that kind of momentum again. But I do think there has been a resurgence of interest across all levels of society in tennis, but then it's got more competition now. It's got pickleball over here, which is a really, really trendy thing. I think it's got more legs than just a trend, but it's taking up a lot of the air and space and discussion about racket sports in our country. Tennis is also lifted in terms of numbers, but there is certainly, it has some more challenges than it would have faced 10, 15 years ago. And I don't think the sport has really honestly used until very recently its platform wisely. It's been too much division in the game, not enough communal effort, and a lot of wasted energy and reinventing the wheel. And I think hopefully the sport wakes up and realizes that it needs to work together, because otherwise it's going to slip in a lot of cultures and a lot of places even further down the totem pole.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you're saying. I think there's an issue for tennis maybe that's been more internal, not the game as such, but it's more like how, with all the organizations we have, ATP, WTA, ITF, it's all a little bit complicated, and like where the focus has been on growing the sport and so on. I think golf did a pretty good job, because it seems like a more like difficult sport to package maybe, because it's even more expensive and has more of a kind of a class barrier still, I would say. But it still does a good job, like with Grow the Game. I think also the Netflix series there was pretty good. I don't play golf anymore really, or I go to the range, but I really like that series on Netflix. Have you seen Breakpoint? What are your thoughts about that, the tennis version of it?
I haven't watched the second season yet, but I personally, for people like you and me who were really into the sport, it didn't really carry a whole lot of weight in terms of things I learned along the way. But I think to see the psychological struggles and the focus on, they got a little bit unlucky. I mean, some of the characters they picked ended up having pretty tough outcomes to their seasons. A guy like Berrettini is a very appealing figure. As a journalist, he's great in the press. He's got a flashy game with the big serve and kind of unusual technique and the big forehand. Looks great. Good to appeal to the young people, but he basically has been hurt, ever since the show came out. So it's you don't get the follow-up that you would normally get on something like that. That's the risk of tennis, of course. But I mean, I think it was a smart move on the sport's part, which was a communal effort on their part to embrace the concept. I don't like the fact that that kind of access is all-encompassing, it seems, and then the print media, people like me, even though I'm leaving that world on a daily basis now, but I don't like the trends there at all. I feel like they're shutting out more and more of the print media's access to the people in the game at the tournaments, and I don't think that's good for anybody, myself. Maybe I'm behind the times, but to me, I think you need to be able to tell these stories and create these connections in a meaningful way, like we have for many decades, and I think that helps tell better stories and helps the public connect with the sport as a whole. And right now, it's all very managed. I mean, Netflix is a managed thing. I mean, yes, they have the cameras everywhere, but ultimately there's a lot of approval and oversight from the sport itself on that. And that's not journalism. It's just entertainment. So part of me likes what I'm seeing, but part of me also doesn't like the trends in general in terms of the way the sport is being covered.
Now, I think the packaging is maybe an issue, because you over-package things. Like, I mean, it becomes like a Kardashians where everything is supposed to be realism, but it's very far from it, right? And I think also the access to players in a relaxed way, or where you can get some like real insight into the personality when you're around the players. For example, I was at Boss Open in Stuttgart just now in the press there, and the players are sometimes very relaxed and they hang out with you. And Tiafoe sat down next to me to watch the remainder of the Fritz match, for example. And he's a super nice guy, very easygoing. He's a kind of a special case in that sense. He's so easy to get to know a bit. But then the problem is if you create that, like where they're only huge stars, and then it's all packaged to be Like it has to be edited and formatted and stuff. You don't get that real insight into the person behind the racket and everything that goes on, which is so important, I think, to also sell the sport.
Well, that's great to hear you had that time with Francis. That's what it takes. I mean, I think it's more a situation where maybe it's the smaller events. Obviously, my life has been more focused around the majors and the big Masters 1000s events and WTA 1000s for a long time, just because that's where the big focus is on results. But you're right. I think those smaller venues are the place where you can make those connections still. And also, it's a bit of a paradox, but it's true. I mean, once you get to a certain level of stardom now in sports or tennis, you don't really need the media anymore. The connection doesn't need to be there. You can go directly to your public with your millions of social media followers and do what you need to do. I'm not saying there can't be a benefit anyway, but I'm not sure that the agents of these stars are going to see it that way. However, and TFO probably already has gone past that level, but other players that are ranked, say, 30 to 200 in the world are very much in a case where the media connection is very important to them, and any kind of exposure they can get or any kind of dialogue they can create is probably useful to their careers and sponsorship, and also for the public to get to know them better. So there is that big split. I think this has gotten wider and wider in my time. Tennis has always been, in my memory bank, a superstar sport. I mean, you had the Navratilovas and the Everts and the Borgs and the Connors and the McEnroes when I came along just as a kid. But I think that the huge gap in how much reach those people have with their own organs through social media versus the rest of the population has just gotten massive. So there's still opportunity for good journalism to be done and connections to be created, but it does feel overly managed now. And also, it's just because how much time does a player have at the top level? It's so divided up now. Before, you might have had the print media to deal with and a little bit of electronic media, and now you have all kinds of in-house media to deal with. The ATP website, the ATP TV station, tennis TV, WTA website, all these different things that didn't used to exist. So if a player has it half an hour after a match, it's divided up in a way that every little ecosystem within tennis gets its little chunk of that, and it's hard to get to know the players and really have that quality dialogue that we used to have.
Yeah, and I think also the press conference, sometimes the quality of the questioning and so on can be a bit difficult to get anything from unless you have the chance to ask your own question, but with limited time. And sometimes it becomes so formatted that it's difficult to get any kind of real insight out of it. It's just, I can understand, like for you writing a book about a player, it's so important to actually have sat down with that player and be able to actually have a normal chat, and ask your questions, not sit there and get kind of like a format of pre-asked questions or whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah, Jonas, I don't want to get too inside tennis for people here listening, but this is an interesting point, is that I feel like the deterioration of those news conferences has a lot to do with the fact that now they're broadcast everywhere and also they're transcripts everywhere, which is, in some ways, was a great thing for print journalists to have transcripts, right? You didn't have to take notes, keep track of everything that was being said. But back in the 90s when I started out early on, none of that existed. And I think if you had a great question that related to the story you were writing today or the next day, and you were close to the sport, you would ask it in the news conference because you wouldn't be cannibalized before you could even use it. Now, if you ask a great question and a new tangent that you're trying to use for a story, the odds are it will already have been tweeted about, put on Instagram and broadcast and used by ATP media before you can even write your story. So it's a disincentive to really have high quality dialogue in there with experienced journalists. I'm not saying that there aren't still great questions asked, and a lot of times with the biggest stars, you're only going to get that access anyway, so it'll probably happen then. But as you say, it's very chopped up into these little micro sections, and so it's hard to have that same kind of flow and continuity. I'm not saying the old days are better than the new days. Everything has its pros and cons. I don't want to be somebody who's nostalgic to the point of being bitter. I'm not. But I remember after big matches in the past, I remember Steffi Graf at the French Open, for example. She'd play a match of importance, and then you'd have the press conference start, and people would actually really question and dissect the match with Steffi, talking about the tactics, not just once, but several times, and that point in the first set, that you won, how was that critical to you? How did that change your mind? It really went through the whole match, kind of bit by bit. You could say that's a little bit dull by today's standards, but to me, as a tennis person, somebody who enjoys playing the sport and enjoys covering it, that kind of high-level dialogue from the athlete about the match they just played, I thought was great. And that's almost entirely gone now. Somebody wins the French Open, it was like you hardly hear a question about the match. It's about like, so what does this mean for number one? Or what does this mean for your future? Or da-da-da-da-da. Or, you know, how does this impact you in terms of your own personal approach to the next slam? It's always looking forward. We don't look back. And so I feel like something's been lost with this modern form of communicating. That's a bit sad, because tennis, as you said before, used the term of talking about Djokovic as a chess master. There's a whole element of chess to it. And we don't talk enough about what just happened. We're too interested in what's going to happen next. And that's the cycle of the news and the cycle of social media that does that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you mentioned. I mean, I'm an old chess player. I used to play like world championships for juniors and stuff like that when I was younger. So I'm following chess still. I don't play actively, only online a bit. But they do that in the press conferences in the world championship. Which I thought was an interesting point from you, is that they actually ask about certain stages in the match, right? Like certain like moves. Why, when you were playing this move, why did you think about it? It's the same in tennis. Like when you hit, you know, when you started going to his backhand, you know, with high loopy shots, which you weren't doing in the first set. How did that change? It also, you know, it requires more in-depth knowledge about tennis from the journalists, which I think is important to get really good questions. But I think the players also like that more, because I think the culture today is a little bit like soundbite. They just want that soundbite, and I think also that puts the players kind of a bit uneasy. You know, they make, okay, if I say something here, if I'm completely honest about something, someone will clip it up and then they will put it out, and then I'm suddenly a villain. You know, it happened now with the break point for Steph Tsitsipas, and it can happen to anyone really. Like, so it's this kind of soundbite culture. I think the players get a bit more apprehensive on actually being just relaxed and talking. You know.
Yeah, sometimes I sit there and go, in a 5 or 10 minute press conference, how many different topics come up? It's like boom, boom, boom. There's not a lot of thread between them. And I'm not saying there aren't questions still about the matches. I mean, obviously, you have a pivotal point in a big match. The journalists were all going to ask about that. It's just more the in-depth looking at the whole arc of a match and the tactical details of it. Not just one question, but several. And the reason that happened in the past was everybody was on the same page. All the journalists in the room, to a large degree, were interested in that. And so they therefore pushed the conversation that direction. Now, you might be interested, but the payoff for that is just not going to be as big, basically because people watching the match on Twitter or whatever they're following it on, they're commenting on it in real time, and all those little details are being discussed in real time. You don't want to go back after the fact. I used to write a lot of what we call in the business game stories, you know, where you go back and write a really detailed, hopefully literary approach to a big match and give it a whole feel and understanding. The call for that is much, much more reduced now than it used to be. I mean, I do it on big finals and majors, but that's about the only time. Otherwise, it's all, I call it, you're all in prologue and epilogue, but you're not doing the actual thing, the actual body too much anymore, which I think's too bad. Hopefully it'll change. Maybe it'll be a trend.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to understand how, you know, a tennis match is broken down into pieces, and I think that's also in the players' minds, but also for the audience to understand, like, there are key moments and we need to capture those. That is the important part. Sometimes I even think the commentators, and that's a very broad generalization, but it's the commentators on TV, they just say things that just happen. They don't add so much spice anymore to what's actually happening. I mean, it depends on the level of the commentator, but it's like you could do so much more here to paint a more vivid picture of what's actually happening in this match. And I think sometimes it's just like a little bit too two-dimensional, you know, and the way we've gone. And that's, I mean, I'm also, you know, a journalist in that sense. Like, I studied in D.C. I worked as a political journalist for like 2 years in the Congress and White House. And I remember back then, this was like 20 years ago, and that it was, you know, the MP3 recorder was new, so there were no social media. There was no like, you know, you could just go selfie mode or anything. So things felt like they were happening more in the now. While with social media, in my opinion, I feel like things are happening for the selfie. You know, it's like you're not watching your kid at school, you're filming your kid at school, which you won't watch later, right? So, and I think that it has an interesting implication in everything we do in life, this like social media thing. And I think also for the players, I know that we have this issue with online gambling and stuff, and players getting, you know, death threats and stupid messages, and that also makes them even more guarded, you know, on social media, because that is their kind of vehicle to say their opinion or whatever, you know.
Yeah, it's a brave athlete who goes and looks at their mentions now, I have to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a tough thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's how different that is from like before. You could get some questions in the press, but now it's like okay, there's like a storm on Twitter or Instagram. If I was a player, I probably want to shut it off. But then the sponsors won't be knocking on your door then. But it seems like a more healthy approach to just like okay, turn off any messages or any kind of comments or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tempest in a teacup, ultimately. I mean, there are exceptions. Things do get really important at times, I guess. But a lot of times it's just tempest in a teacup, but it's hard to ignore the teacup sometimes and see the bigger picture. I agree.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to ask you, are you a tennis player from the start? Like, how did you get into tennis? I know you wrote about many other sports as well. Maybe not pickleball as of yet, but how do you get into the tennis scene?
I did write about pickleball. Actually, I wrote one of my last pieces as a staff writer for the New York Times was I played padel, pickleball, and tennis in San Diego for a couple hours and just was compared the experience. But I haven't written a lot about it for sure. No, me, I mean, I'm a hopelessly limited tennis player. I have been from the beginning, but I've been playing a long time. I mean, I started playing when I was 6, 7 years old. I played junior tennis. My father was in the U.S. Navy, so we were stationed on both coasts and in Hawaii as a kid. We moved around all the time, and tennis was kind of my ability, my thing that helped me connect with people in these different communities. But I played junior tennis in Hawaii. I played some junior tennis in Southern California. I played high school tennis in Southern California. I played college tennis at the Division III level, which is non-scholarship level. And I've played, as an adult, lots of tennis. Got hurt, blew out my Achilles at one point, so I took a long break from playing singles and playing tennis at kind of a regular recreational level. Played a lot more platform tennis, which is kind of a northeastern version of padel. Played in a cage in the wintertime on an elevated court where it's heated from below and you use paddles and play off the fences. It's a great game. But lately, I've gotten way back into tennis again. I've started to play several times a week and I'm playing a lot more of the game again. So it's been, I think, really helpful to my tennis writing to get back into it and to sort of feel how the technology is affecting the shots and try out a whole bunch of different rackets. And I've always followed the game, but I've really gotten back into playing again. I think for a long time, like many of us, I was never a great player, but I was pretty good. And you get to a point where you can never get that good again, so it's frustrating. So you try something new. In my case, it was platform tennis or skiing or whatever it was. But now I'm getting to the stage in life where I forgot how good I used to be. And I'm just happy to be out there again. And I know I wasn't that good when I started again, so now I'm feeling the progress. I think that's kind of what it comes down to. I mean, I get enough competition in my daily job as a journalist. I don't need cutthroat competition in my sport life. Nobody cares anyway but me. But I do enjoy the idea of making progress. And for whatever reason, I can feel the progress again now as I've come back to tennis. And I've really enjoyed plunging back into it again.
Yeah, that's the beauty of sports, like seeing your own progress, really. So what did you think, like if you had the three sports, I had to ask you that as well, like padel, pickleball or tennis? I guess tennis is close to your heart, that would be my guess. But what do you think about padel, for example, which is huge in Europe these days? Sounds
like you're in the same spot. I lived in Sevilla in Spain for about 8 years, back in 96 to 2004 in that range. I mean, I was on the road a lot, but we were based there more or less. And padel was already pretty big then in Spain, obviously. It had a really big boom in the 90s, like it did in Argentina. And so I had never really seen it. I wasn't playing platform tennis yet. So I got to Sevilla and my friends were playing, so I started to play. I played a couple times a week for a while. I thought it was a great game. I loved it. I mean, to me, the sound of the padel ball meeting paddle is a great sound. It's got this percussive sort of ballistic sound to it. Very satisfying sort of thing. I was a serve and volley player as a California hardcourt player growing up in tennis, so that translated pretty well to padel. I played some squash in college as well, so not competitively but recreationally. So I love the idea the walls were incorporated. So to me, padel's a great game. I'm hardly a groundbreaker in that opinion. I think it's a sport that has a lot of appeal. I know also, interestingly enough, I've heard in Sweden they overbuilt the courts. There was a big boom. It's kind of dropped off in numbers. I know Spain experienced that in Argentina as well. So maybe there's some limitations there in terms of what it carries forward, either through the appeal competitively, hits a wall at some point, no pun intended. But I feel like, to me, as a base game, great, and very reactive and explosive sort of game when it's played at a decent level. Pickleball felt very tactical to me. I'm not sure how many people that are listening to this from your end of it will have played pickleball, but it's got the wiffle ball and the plastic paddles, and you can play it with super fast twitch, but then a lot of it is just in this forecourt area where you can't enter to create the space around the net. It's a lot of little slices and dinks and touches and angles. So I felt like it was kind of like turning from a rock into a rabbit. You're going from sort of really low pace, tactical stuff to boom, 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 finish the point. So that part was interesting, having to change the gears. Don't think I want to play it in singles, but it seemed like a fun doubles game. But for me, tennis has it all because you got the longer lever on the racket, the difficulty of keeping the ball in control in that sort of 3D space, even though you don't have the walls. It's a bigger court, more running involved. Seemed like a greater variety of shot, and still seems like the king of sports to me. But I definitely see the appeal of the other two, and there are other things coming, perhaps. Who knows what else. And platform tennis, which I discussed, is not big in Europe, but I could certainly see that becoming a big thing down the road, other places in colder climes in Europe or Asia, because it's got a lot of appeal to play an outdoor racket sport in the middle of the winter, in cold temperatures.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense. Platform. I haven't tried it, but I played pickleball, paddle. I'm of the opinion that I usually get a lot of, like, if I bring up any pickleball, I usually get people like, "Yo, this is a tennis channel. This is a tennis." For me, it's more like if people exercise and have fun. Although my love is tennis, I'm happy about it. Like, I have friends that play primarily pickleball, primarily paddle, primarily tennis, and I can happily play with either of them, right? But I think that is generally a better approach in my head instead of being angry, I guess.
Yeah,
I can see, the pickleball.
I think you'll see more of that. I mean, you're not going to see huge amounts probably, but I think you're going to see a lot of crossover. Like, I got a lot of pleasure out of playing. The other day I played. I'm back here in the North Shore of Boston area. The other day I played 2 hours of tennis in the morning, and then had a friend invite me to play platform at night. So I went out and played platform at night. So, I mean, I can see mixing the pleasures. I know from my story I did in San Diego when I played all three, there are a lot of guys who'll play padel and then drop the padel paddles and head over to the tennis courts and play for an hour after. So you're going to see, hopefully, there's a lot of, looks to me from the story that I did in reporting, a lot of big clubs are going to be created, at least in the U.S. in the coming years, that are going to have these options, kind of like a food court of racket sports, and you'd be able to play all different ones. Sure, you're going to maybe migrate to the one in which you excel, but I think people will be happier trying out different ones as time goes on, and I think that's good. I mean, ultimately, I agree with you. We have a very sedentary culture right now. I don't think that's good for anybody. Ultimately, public health should be a big concern, and I think the racket sports mini boom in the U.S. and some other places, even though the reasons weren't great with the pandemic, of course, but the fact that this has happened, I think it's a positive thing. And racket sports have been proven to extend life and quality of life and all those sorts of things. So, frankly, even as a tennis writer and a guy who makes his living in tennis, whatever gets you out there, hopefully with a racket in your hand, is to me a good thing.
I 100% agree. What do you think about doubles, by the way? Do you play any doubles? Do you think doubles has a kind of a... I know Riley Opelka, he came up with this statement on some podcast and maybe Twitter and said, like, there's no point in doubles. We could, abolish it or whatever. He wasn't really caring much for it. What's your opinion there?
Well, I mean, I can see in terms of the revenue that it creates, that argument. And obviously in terms of the people are not going to pay big media rights because of the doubles aspect. It's just not happening. But the counter argument is that tradition of the game is huge with doubles. I would say the women's game still, you see Jessie Pegula and Coco Gauff playing doubles at the highest level, and you see Barbora Krejcikova playing at the highest level and having been number 2 in the world in doubles. And Rybakina, Sabalenka all recently played doubles as well. So there's a huge amount of top women's players who still play doubles. So that star appeal is there on that end of the sport. But also I think ultimately, I've been playing more singles than doubles lately because I'm enjoying my last moments of maybe doing that. But I played loads of doubles in my life. I was a better doubles player in college than singles player, and many, many people on the recreational level in tennis, play much more doubles than singles and can really relate to it. And all you have to do is go out to Wimbledon and go out in the back courts in the second week and see how much enthusiasm there is for the doubles game, or You see it in Australia and New York as well. The doubles being played, people really understand it. They follow it. They appreciate it. They understand the athleticism in play, and they can relate to it. So I think to get rid of it would be a mistake. But I do see Rowley's point. I mean, in terms of the prize money aspects, and if it's breaking into the singles players' paychecks or hurting their exposure, I can see why he might have an argument there. But ultimately, if a big star decides to play doubles, I mean, go back in the men's game. I mean, who's the last guy to have been high level in both at the same time? I guess Kafelnikov might have been the last guy. It's been a while, right? I may be missing somebody, but that's what it would take. Somebody to play at the high level, and like a McEnroe did back in the day, and suddenly doubles is more your focus, more on top of it. So, but it's just tennis, especially in the Grand Slam situation with best of 5 in men's singles. There isn't the space for the media to cover either electronically or in print really the doubles the way it deserves. And I think it's too bad, but it's a bit of a bandwidth issue as well.
Yeah, I agree. And but I also think the doubles, there's a point to it sometimes when you get players that are going to team up. For example, I think Kyrgios was teaming up with, I don't remember exactly who now, it was Jack Sock maybe, for the US Open. And then it's like a little bit of a hype, these guys going to play together. We had Roger and Rafa, topical in this podcast, playing together in the Laver Cup. And that kind of creates an atmosphere. So there's definitely a point to including it. Then the question is obviously, what can you do with the media, and can you do, can you change it up somehow? I don't know really, but there's still an interest.
You're right. I mean, Kyrgios I forgot Kyrgios. I mean, Kyrgios hasn't been top 10 in singles, but even though he might have been close if Wimbledon had points last year, but he's mega attraction, and he's playing doubles and seems to enjoy it, and that put doubles suddenly close to the front page, and they were broadcasting it and filling stadiums in Australia when he and Kokkinakis were playing and winning the Aussie Open last year. So that's an example right there of what doubles could be. But then the sport has to create an environment where the top players are able to make that choice and play both, and then want to prioritize it. But the knowledge from the public is there to support the game of doubles. And I think tennis is a game of tradition, right? I mean, why are the majors what they are? Why do the Grand Slams matter? Why does Monte Carlo matter, or Rome, and those places? Because of tradition, right? And doubles is part of the tradition of the game.
Do you think tennis would need some format changes at some point? Because there seems to be like an attraction in, for example, team events. Some players love teams more. There's maybe like some nostalgia around the Davis Cup, how it changed. People want the old format back. And I know in the US you have the World Team Tennis, right? Which seems pretty popular in bringing up, some more crowd engagement. College tennis is huge for the crowds, at least around the colleges. Do you think there would be more space for team tennis in some way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, don't exaggerate the appeal of WTT in our country. I mean, it's very, very minor. It's had bigger moments in the past for sure. I mean, hard to believe, but Jimmy Connors and Chris Evert missed the French Open 1 year or two because of World Team Tennis back in the day. I think Bjorn Borg did as well. So there was a time when it was backed by much greater forces and had a much bigger role in the society. Now it's a minor thing, can be entertaining, but it's not really impacting the overall ecosystem. I think college tennis in the U.S. is really undervalued. Frankly, it's a great product. It doesn't get a lot of big crowds or big media attention, but it's a great atmosphere in terms of when you go out and actually watch a college tennis match. And we obviously produced quite a lot of very good players in recent years again on the Pro Tour. So I think there's room to move there. I wouldn't want to saturate with team events. I mean, I think with Davis Cup, with the Laver Cup, which Federer's vehicle with his agency, I think both of those are well implanted. Obviously, we lost the ATP Cup now, so there's a little bit less of a team event thing. The Hopman Cup's going to come back in Nice later this year on clay. Alcaraz is committed to play for Spain.
Oh wow!
So it's just a matter of how much you need. I think we need some for sure. People think the Olympics might benefit from becoming a team competition instead of being an individual. I've heard that argument before. Could see some appeal to that. Ultimately, I think the big decision tennis will have to make down the road is whether they stick with the best of 5 for the men on the Grand Slam level. You made a comment earlier about 1 serve versus 2. That would certainly speed things up. I don't mind myself the format of best of five with shorter sets, tiebreak at 4-all or 5-all instead of 6-all. It's true, it's a long ask for anybody to sit through a bunch of 5-set matches. I personally love the format. I'm connected to it from my whole childhood, having watched so many great matches, best of five, and seen that momentum build and that drama build. Davis Cup back in the day was some of the best tennis I ever saw. Watched a lot of it in Sweden as well because that was such a big event in Sweden. And I personally, I'm too deep into it to reject it. But I certainly can see why there should be a debate about it, and whether that going best of three for the men or best of three partially for the men at the majors might be a decision that would help speed up the game, give people a little bit more of a digestible format. But that grandeur and that epic quality to a 5-set classic match is pretty powerful thing. But that will be a debate for sure, and I think what you alluded to with the racket head sizes, string things. And the other question I often have is if the average height of a player is going to be 6'4", 6'5" down the road, should the net remain the same height that it's at for the pro game as well? I mean, the net was put at its current height, and I think there's actually a bow in the middle of it, if I'm not mistaken, because that's the way nets used to be. You could obviously have a net like that if you wanted to have it directly across and perpendicular to the ground, parallel to the ground. But you want it to be the same height when the players are all 10 centimeters or 12 centimeters on average taller, or 3 or 4 inches taller. I don't know. These are questions that you could ask. And maybe that's what makes the serve as important as it's become. I mean, if a Riley Opelka at almost 7 feet tall can hit a flat, wide serve in the ad court, straight down at the court, I mean, that's an angle nobody else can replicate. But should the sport try to find ways to mitigate some of that? These are all good questions.
Yeah, and I think that needs some discussion. I mean, I know that Patrick Mouratoglou is trying this UTS, which is Ultimate Tennis Showdown, I think. It's a very extreme variation of tennis with the scoring and the cards you can choose and so on. But I think the discussion should be there, and I think it's good that next-gen finals, for example, try a few things, with the 5 sets in 4 games, right? It makes sense to me in a way that they are trying something. And then we see. But I'm an old school guy. I like the 5 sets. The story of a 5-set match, you can't beat it. That's why the Grand Slams, are so important for tennis, because it's like that kind of fight. You're going down 2 sets to love, and you can fight back, and it becomes this seesaw event. This is just outstanding entertainment for a tennis nerd, tennis fan. The French Open, you covered it. We were there at the same time. Didn't get a chance to meet. It was a bit crazy because I was only there for 2 days, or just really a few hours here and there. How is it for you? You go for 2 whole weeks. You cover the whole event. How do you work that out?
Well, my life just changed,
Yeah.
For a long time. I mean, I've covered over 100 Grand Slam tournaments in my career. And,
it's crazy,
yeah, it's a lot of, you add it all up, I think I've spent, I figured it, yeah, pretty much close to 4 full years of my life watching Grand Slam tennis. So, that's a lot of your life just to watch those 4 events. But I wouldn't trade it. But the normal thing for a print journalist for most of my career is you are on the hunt for a good story every day. Basically that's it. Back in the day when I started out, I would write, one main story. I would write a sidebar, we call it, like a side story, and then I would write a notes column. I'd write 3 stories a day, pretty full. Wow. And then as the internet took over, it became clear that people had less appetite for as much, even though there was a limitless expanse available. You only can focus on so many things. So we ended up narrowing it down really to 1 quality story a day that would often be updated, but be one we call it a byline each day. And so the day is spent basically in a rising adrenaline, starting your day very relaxed, having your coffee, thinking about what you might write about. And as the deadline approached, then your pulse rate started to go up and decisions had to get made, and you focus on whatever it was, and then you hope that Nadal or Federer or Sampras or Agassi didn't lose on your deadline. But yeah, always tennis is a sport of stars and a sport of upsets. So if a big star goes down, you will write about that. So there was always what we started to call it our list of must-writes by the end. You knew that if one of the big 3 lost, or if Serena lost, or if Sharapova lost back in the day, whatever it was, whatever you were planning for that day was going to go by the wayside, and you were going to write the match that they lost, because that was what people would be interested in. And that's still, I think, that will remain the same with Grand Slam or major coverage, for the foreseeable future. My last French Open that you were at and I was at, this most recent one, I was researching my book and writing for my new Substack site, which is Tennis and Beyond, which I just started about a month ago, and a subscription site, and I had a much different pace, and I can tell you I could get used to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think the Substack movement, I've seen it with other journalists, like more in maybe the political space or science space, but I think there's a lot of room for growth there for you for sure, but also you have definitely more freedom. So you're excited about this new step towards more Substack and your upcoming book.
Well, I'm a newbie on the Substack front for sure. I've written books before. I felt like it would be a good way for me to manage my withdrawal pains on daily journalism. I don't want to be back chasing the news like I did for 35 years or more. I want to be able to have a bigger view and do the research I need. And having a Substack account, I think, allows you the control of when you write. If breaking news breaks, I don't have to write about it right away. I can come to it in my time if I have the time to do it. But I want to do it seriously, so I give people who subscribe, value for their investment, and I also want to use it as a way to give people a window into who are interested into, how these books get produced. Once the book is finished on Nadal, I want to talk about some aspects of it with readers on Substack and give them insights into the process and some previews into what's going to be in it and how, what I learned from the process. Hopefully it kind of creates this dialogue that I haven't always had time to do justice to over the years. I'm excited about that. And, it's not my main source of income. Obviously, my books are going to be that. But I do want to do it with good intentions and do it regularly. And so far, it's been really rich, and I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. I'm very happy for you. It sounds like a great thing, and I'll make sure to subscribe to it. I will put the link for people here below. I had one last question. I'm sorry to bother you with all these questions, but I wrote it down. You were schoolmates with Barack Obama, the former president. Do you have any fun story growing up alongside him or anything?
Don't let me exaggerate my importance in the story here. I was I don't know what terms you use in Europe, but I was a freshman in high school when he was a senior.
Yeah, okay.
We were at Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is an old missionary school, which is a wonderful school. A tremendous place. Feels more like a college campus, so it's very big. Cool. So Barack Obama wouldn't know me from Adam, as we say in English. I was a little tiny guy, and he was a big guy on campus. Would you have picked out Barry Obama was his name then? It wasn't Barack. Barry Obama, would you have picked him to be the future leader of the world? Absolutely not. Seemed like a cool guy, unusual guy. Not many African Americans in Hawaii, even fewer at Punahou School. So it's more of an Asian-dominated society in Hawaii, traditionally with people coming, Pacific Islanders and Asians, immigrants coming in. Somebody like Barack with a partially Kenyan ancestry is an unusual sort of thing. I think he grew up with a very different mentality than many African Americans might have in the mainland of the U.S. because of living in Hawaii. I think he's written about this in his books. But the funny thing is that, he was a very good basketball player, but our team was extremely good. So he wasn't even a starter on the basketball team when Punahou won the state championship in Hawaii when I was there as a freshman. I remember going to the games. He had a pretty big afro at that point, but I remember him being a very well-liked and respected character on campus. But President Obama in the future, nobody could have known that. And certainly, probably not even him, I'm sure he didn't know that either. So,
no, it's pretty refreshing and good. If you had the idea that he was going to become president, you probably wouldn't have been a nice guy.
Yeah. Well, I think he was somebody who he had a very easy appeal. But did I know him? No. But I certainly knew of him, and we all followed that team that did so well at Punahou and watched him play from the sidelines. But he was only number 6 on the roster.
That's cool. That's a nice story. All right. Thanks a lot, Chris. This has been great. I really enjoyed talking to you. Wish you all the best with the Rafa book. Do you have any kind of deadlines or any kind of release approximates you can give?
Look, our plan is to release it in 2024. No one wants to rush Rafa out the door. Hopefully Rafa plays for many more years. I just think it's a good time to try to look at his career and begin to sum it up. This book is not going to be a conventional biography either. The Master was not on Federer. This is not going to be a Rafa A to Rafa Z sort of story. So I think it'll be okay, even if he's still playing, if it comes out next year. Not sure exactly on the date yet, but my main writing is beginning now. The book's behind me. I'm going to be in this position typing away for the next few months, and fingers crossed it'll be good and something people want to read.
Great. I'm going to read it for sure. I'm going to Mallorca tomorrow, so I'll see Tony there. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah, I was just there not long ago. I definitely enjoyed seeing everything down there and the installation. So.
Yeah, they have the academy is amazing there, actually. And I mean, it's an amazing island overall, Mallorca. It's super nice. So we'll see. But I'm going for the ATP 250, so it's more work than the pleasure of Mallorca. But we'll be fun anyway.
I like your background there. So what do you got? What do you got up against the walls? Those are all your sticks?
Yeah, I have 150 rackets and strings, and like my whole home is. I have a stringing machine over there and a 3-in-1 machine to measure all the rackets. That one is a personal frame they made for me, one company. Have a racket addiction, you can say, pretty much. What did you try anything interesting when you were?
I'm curious about you though. What was your level? What is your level?
I'm play ITF seniors. Like the events. I've won one, and yeah, I can play, but I'm not like a fantastic player. But I can hit with some good players.
Good stuff. And how old are you?
41.
Okay, so you're still in your prime. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like a prime. I like 40. It's pretty good age.
41's a new 31. I think we subtract 10, right? That's the way it is from what it used to.
Well, I've said that myself. It's how it feels. Like everything. I mean, it's the same for you. Maybe you subtract 15 then. From 15.
Oh no. I'll take 10. But yeah, I mean, I think people go, "You're playing singles still?" I said, "Yeah, 58. I can play tennis. Play some singles. I'm not running as fast, but you can still enjoy it." But I think there is some truth to that. I think people are keeping themselves a little more preserved, a little longer.
Yeah,
maybe it's all that.
We're eating better and stuff, right? Yeah.
And what were you going to ask me? What kind of racket maybe I use? Or
you said you were testing some new equipment, so I was curious about what's your racket choice.
I guess I'm like a WTA player because what sticker the WTA players using the most? It's the blade, right? I see the blade everywhere. I was amazed how many people were using it at Roland Garros. So I must have seen like a good 1/3 of the field had the blade. I tried out a bunch, like the YoneXs, but the blade, I'm using the Blade 98, the 1619. Feels pretty good.
That's a good stick. Yeah,
like
what they're actually using, this is kind of what I've been doing over the years, but it's like they're actually using most of them are using a Steam racket, an older Pro stock model that Wilson still produces for the pros, but not for the retail audience. And you can tell it has like 4 white grommets at the throat. So you can see that it's a Steam racket. It's a Steam 100 BLX. It's a more powerful racket. It's more like a Pure Drive from Babolat or the Wilson Ultra. So WTA players mostly want lots of power and not as heavy, of course. Like they play quite light. I would say Raducanu, even Sabalenka, not that heavy, but the pros in the men's side, what you've seen is that they're very heavy. The older pros like Gasquet, Nadal play really heavy. But then the young guys now are playing lighter rackets because they swing so much faster. So you have like Alcaraz and Fritz, and these guys play relatively light for such high-level players.
What do you know about Rafa's rackets?
I have one. Well, my friend has one, and he has them really pretty heavily spec'd up with lots of weight up in the hoop. And it's the first original version. Like it's the 2004, and then he's customized it over the years, adding weight to have bit more effortless power, overall.
So the one your friends got is the one from the 05 French period when he won the French the first time?
Yeah, but it's painted as the Cortex, the next generation, but you see it in the throat. There's no Cortex. It's just because they used to just paint the Cortex on the racket. Babolat used to do that. That's what they all do. If the head has flex point technology with a hole in the side that they had in the early 2000s, I have Agassi's frame, for example, from that era. It's just painted. So it's one of those funny things actually about the pros, that it's like, why would they keep changing rackets or shoes or strings? They want to be with what they know, right? Always. So
you don't think Rafa didn't actually change models and later on at all?
No, not at all. No. I have friends that own his personal frames as well. So it's Now they actually released an Origin racket from Babolat in the new design, and it's as heavy as Rafa's racket, but it's not exactly the same. But it's as heavy. So it's if you want to feel like how it is to swing Rafa's racket, which is a log but fun, then that racket it's crazy heavy, right? It's feels like a tank to swing.
Do you have any idea what it weighs all let up? Any idea?
Yeah, I have it here. It's around 345 grams with strings, which is not so much. But when you balance it, there's so much weight in the hoop, so the swing weight is like 370. And swing weight 370 is high, right? That's, very few players go higher. I mean, Murray goes about the same. You have Moya, who used to have 400, crazy swing weight almost.
Was Carlos that much? Wow, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, so they have really weird. Both Moya and Rafa have slightly weird rackets, I would say, but they're similar in the way they're weighted up. I think it has some connection, to how they play and also being so close in a sense, right?
Well, Carlos he was the first major player to use bobblette, right? If I'm not mistaken, right? Wasn't he the first main?
No, for them, they bought the mold from Pro Kennex, and then they got Moya to play with it, and it was actually a soft drive, which is a racket I also have. We have his personal racket at the office, and it's a crazy racket because it's only 322 grams, which is not much strong from a pro player, but he has even more weight in the hoop. So you cannot balance it on the finger; it's just going to fall off. So it's an insane racket to play. I don't know how he played with this racket. Like for me, I love the racket, but the way he customized it for me is crazy.
And when you say in the hoop, I'm always thinking that all my guys in my level were all doing it on the top of the head. But you're saying anywhere in, or is it more top of the hoop?
If you want to maximize swing weight and like you call it polarization, for example, Rafa, who plays with a lot of spin, he polarizes his racket. So there's a lot of weight in the handle, lots of weight at 12 o'clock. So if you have the clock face of the racket, it's 12. Then you have guys who hit it maybe a bit more flat, like Novak, for example, which uses a smaller head size. He has more 3 and 9. These types of positions because it helps this twist weight, like the stability of the racket. I have Novak's personal frame here actually on my shelf.
It's the speed racket, that he's got,
Yeah, but it's not actually a speed. It's a pro stock model they've made for him. Very specific. There are other pros that use similar models, but it's quite specific for Novak. It's based on an old Radical, but they opened up the string pattern and they made it this much longer, like really. Like a minuscule amount extra length, just to reduce the weight a bit and still get the same power. Yeah. So right now I even went out for dinner with Steph the other in Stuttgart to help him with some racket stuff. So it's a lot of technical things.
But I mean, it's exactly right. These guys are it's the princess and the pea, right? They can feel the slightest thing.
Exactly. They feel, and they are not usually so good at communicating what they feel. I mean, it's very personal language, right? So sometimes someone says a racket is stiff, and it's technically not stiff. It's very flexible, but to them, somehow the feeling they emit from the racket is that it's stiff. It's like a food, You're like, I'm feeling this flavor, but it's not quite technically that flavor. So I see that with a lot of players, right?
But what you're saying, just so I'm clear, because what I'm doing, it's actually helpful to me. From what you understand, Rafa never really switched the frames in terms of 05 to now. All these changes is types of strings, right?
He added weight. So lead tape, he did change strings about 3 times. So he had a string called Babla Duralast. Then he had Pro Hurricane for a bit, and then Babla released RPM Blast, which is it's a very good string. It's a pretty stiff string. Which you used very thick gauge, so 135 gauge. That's 15, I think, if you go in that old gauge metric, right? So he's also very superstitious, so he doesn't change string tension much. He's one of those guys that I want 56 pounds, always. He doesn't really
slight change for altitude, I guess. That's about all he does, right?
Yeah. But he is even for conditions, very, very kind of stuck on one kind of specification. I don't think he doesn't want to have too much fluctuation in his feeling or whatever. You know how it is with the water bottles. So I guess I know.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Sweden, in Västerås, 1 hour from Stockholm. 150,000 people. City, pretty small.
On the water?
Yeah. It's a big lake there. Mälaren, it's called. It's a pretty place, I would say. Now going back, I haven't lived there for so long, but when I go back a bit for a week or so, I enjoy it because we stay by the lake, and it's quite nice.
Does the lake connect to the Baltic, or is it an inland lake?
It's an inland lake, but you can get out, right?
Yeah, I've been there a lot. I went there a lot back in the 90s for winter sport, and went back for Davis Cup back when the Swedes were doing well in Davis Cup in Gothenburg and those places. So
yeah, Swedish tennis was different back then. It's not the same.
Yeah, I covered a lot of Magnus Norman and Magnus Larsson and Björkman and those guys. So
the narrative in Sweden is that the Swedish Tennis Federation kind of thought that we had a production factory of talent, and then you just you don't need to do anything. We just let them grow out of the woods. But it was kind of a team thing, and that's how they came up. And now it's a pretty miserable in a way of terms of talent. Like we have the Ymer brothers, but they're not making any real, and they're not so well liked in Sweden because they make really aggressive statements in the media all the time, and they don't play the Swedish tournament. So it's a weird tennis vibe in Sweden.
No, I wasn't aware of that dynamic. I'm not surprised. It's interesting.
All right, man. I
We'll
will
stay
not
in
keep
touch.
you
I appreciate the expertise on the rackets. That's helpful to me.
Yeah, anytime, man.
I enjoyed the conversation.
Same.
I wish you well.
Yeah, same. We keep in touch.
Okay. Say hi to Mallorca.